we're going to have the first session, and a part of that session is going to be led by Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, who is the chair of the CODESRIA Scientific Committee, popularly known as Bio. So I'll mix those two, but in the interest of time and for the purpose of proceeding as planned, Prof, please.
Thank you very much, Godwin, and I also join in saying good morning to all of the colleagues. My task this morning is actually a very simple one, which is to introduce our chief guest of honor for the first of the solidarity messages. It's called the solidarity speech from our special guest of honor. But knowing the Honourable Thoko Didiza, I'm sure that it will be much more than just a solidarity message. Honourable Thoko Didiza is currently Minister of Agriculture, Land and Rural Development in the Republic of South Africa. But for those who may not know her or be familiar with her biography, I can say that coming out of an activist anti-apartheid background, both within the church groups and outside of the church groups, mostly in the KwaZulu-Natal area of South Africa. In 1994, she joined the cabinet and became the youngest minister in the cabinet in the first post-apartheid government under the leadership of Nelson Mandela. And at various points since then, she has remained in public service, mostly around the portfolio of agriculture and land at different points in time, serving under President Thabo Mbeki, stepping out of government briefly following the resignation of President Mbeki, and returning after the election of President Cyril Ramaphosa. But above all else, I think it is a just choice to make for a chief guest for this occasion, because Honourable Thoko Didiza has also been a CODESRIA militant all through. She has been very active in the work of the council, from the General Assembly in Marrakesh, not in Marrakesh, in Rabat, from the General Assembly in Rabat to this current assembly. She has never really lost any opportunity to show support and solidarity with CODESRIA. And more substantively, for the period when she was in the academy, helping to set up the Thabo Mbeki Leadership Institute at the University of South Africa. She also was a strong pillar of support for the work which the council did with the late Archie Mafeji, one of the founding lights of CODESRIA, after whom a center was actually named at the University of South Africa. And I should just add there that for much of the work which she did at UNISA, at the University of South Africa, both on the Thabo Mbeki Leadership Institute and in support of Archie Mafeji, Honourable Thoko Didiza, true to her background as a civil society social movement activist, actually did this as a volunteer unpaid job, basically contributing and giving back to the community. It is therefore my distinct honor and pleasure to invite the Honourable Thoko Didiza to share her solidarity message with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Olukoshi. And thank you for the introduction, and I trust that I'll be true to what you believe I'll be able to do this morning. I was not inducted as to what the chief guest means by the executive secretary, other than saying I must share my thoughts and give a solidarity message as we celebrate CODESRIA's 50th year. The President of CODESRIA, Professor Isabel Casemiro, Vice Presidents and members of the Executive Committee, Chairperson of the Scientific Committee and members of the Scientific Committee present, members of CODESRIA's General Assembly present, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed an honor and privilege that I have been invited to celebrate with you the 50 years of CODESRIA's existence during the 16th General Assembly here in Dakar, Senegal, where CODESRIA was founded. CODESRIA holds a special part in the development of autonomous intellectuals that are underpinned by the spirit of Pan-Africanism. Most African countries, when they got their independence around the 1960s and the formation of the African Organization of African Unity in 1963, raised a critical challenge amongst our scholars to try and formulate their own perspectives of what is Africa's development or what it should be, particularly a difference from the strongly dominated thought of the Western colonizers. In 1973, CODESRIA was founded by the Deans of Social Sciences as home of progressive African scholars, with a leftist leaning underpinned by the idea that Africa shares as a common history of oppression. Again, when one reflects on this, it puts at the center the importance of our universities and their contribution towards development of our societies. CODESRIA is, in my view, an institution that builds an autonomous Pan-African scientific community that is capable of interpreting realities in Africa and contributing to finding solutions to continental issues. Some of CODESRIA's research work have contributed to understanding the impacts of certain policies such as the structural adjustment programs, which were implemented by African countries, even though not because of their choice, but because of imposition by the Bretton Woods institutions. Some of the African thought that have come through these scholars who are members of CODESRIA have actually contributed in reimagining how to deal with the land question, which has always been at the core of Africa's liberation struggles. Program Director, it brings me joy to be amongst the people celebrating this institution here today, which has nurtured some great scholars in Africa and contributed immensely to the development of African knowledge and perspectives. However, today, I do not see myself as a special guest, or rather a chief guest, as it has been said, but rather as part of this family. In 2011, I was tasked by the University of South Africa to set up the Achimafejo Research Institute. This was an enormous task. And in my view, I needed to know who was Achimafejo, what was his work, what did he do in contributing to Africa's development. This journey led me first and foremost to engage with his family in understanding his formative years and his locality and how that had shaped who he was. It further led me to those who have worked with him, some of whom I had met in my earlier years in the early 2000s, people such as Professor Sam Moyo, who through him, I was put in contact with a number of people who have worked with Professor Mafeja. This led me later to be invited in that year by Dr. Ibrahim Assal to the General Assembly in Rabat, Morocco. I wish to pause here and honor some of these fine scholars who have made a lasting impression on me as a person and who I believe have been and continue to be the true ambassadors of CODESRIA. Professor Sam Moyo, Professor Shahida Elbaz, may their souls rest in peace. Professor Adebayo Olugoshi, Professor Jimmy Adesina, Professor Fred Hendricks, and Dr. Murunga, to mention but a few. The 2011 General Assembly will hold a special part in my heart because it brought me into contact with the community of social scientists and scholars who have worked with Mafeje and immersed me in appreciating the work of CODESRIA to this day. Program Director, the contribution that CODESRIA has made in social sciences has been enormous and impactful. The body of knowledge that has been produced over the years is evidence of the impeccable work that has been done by many of you who are here and those that have not made it to this General Assembly. This scientific community has developed over the years, has also benefited from the platform that CODESRIA as an institution has provided. Young researchers, some of whom I've met during this assembly, have found a home where they could be nurtured and supported. Through continuous internal review, CODESRIA as an organization has grown and remained relevant but also resilient. A number of policy briefs that have been of value to policymakers here at home and abroad have actually been as a result of many scholars who are members of CODESRIA. This organization has always been a reminder that knowledge development is critical and must respond to the challenges that societies face at every given point, and therefore relevance remains important. Program Director, today as we celebrate, we also look back to those who went before us and the journey they've traversed. It is in moments like this that we remind ourselves of the history of this organization, that which has been written and some that has not been written but given to us through oral history. It has helped us to understand the mammoth task that these founders have had in creating such an institution. We also appreciate the sacrifices they've made in order to have this organization that we proudly belong to this day. We wish to honor these founders and the pioneers who had foresight to build an alternative voice whose articulation will reflect the Pan-African thought in understanding our societies, their conditions, and their developmental trajectories. In celebrating and honoring them, by extension, we honor their families who gave them space and time to build an organization that has grown in stature as a repository of critical thinking and a progressive voice from the South and in the African continent. This celebration has been marked in a special way true to CODESRIA's mission, where the community of scholars have been reflecting on critical issues that have and continue to impact our societies to this day. Understanding the pandemics and how it has impacted our societies from various vantage points have been very important in my view. Some of the papers presented during this General Assembly have given us insights on how at national, continental, and globally we have responded to a life-threatening condition that we were least prepared for. The various papers presented also challenged and critiqued policy as well as regulatory frameworks and approaches that were put in place as part of containing the pandemic. The papers presented also identified gaps in our country's social policies that could not withstand the challenges at the time. The other elements that some of the papers raised was the lack of engagement between the state and non-state actors and the citizens in working at finding solutions to present day's problem. This body of knowledge presented during this week, in my view, will enrich many in our continent and beyond on how to address pandemics in the future. Program Director and members of the Assembly, I may have missed the papers that undertook research which will give us insight on the state actions and what informed them. It will be interesting to know what perspectives informed those who were in decision-making at the time of the pandemic. If not done, it may form another research agenda that such scholars like yourselves and others may undertake going towards another 50 years of CODESRIA. Program Director, permit me to share our experience in terms of policy formulation in South Africa and in some part, the African Union Specialized Technical Committee on Agriculture, Water Resources and Environment. We were looking at the challenge of food security during the pandemic. When the reality and threats of the pandemic descended on our shores, as policymakers in agriculture, we engaged with all stakeholders in the food systems to determine the state of food and measures needed to preserve the availability of food, not only in our individual countries, but also the continent as a whole. These engagements between state and non-state actors ensured that we pursue the policy formulation within our governments to declare agriculture an essential service in order to allow farmers and processors to continue to produce despite the pandemic. It was also critical to influence policies that related to trade and border movement because of the interconnectedness of many countries to one another. It therefore was necessary to ensure that as we continued with the lockdown, which was a containment strategy adopted by many countries, we also had to allow movement such that within our countries and outside, we are able to ensure that food availability is there. In the quest of ensuring every citizen had access to food, we had to also prioritize resources to provide inputs and support to people who lost their jobs, as well as small-scale farmers and subsistence farmers, in order to ensure that they can produce their own food and those of their immediate families and neighborhood. In our view, this helped to circumvent hunger-induced protests which might have resulted as a result of food insecurity. What we found interesting is that some of the agricultural facilities which we use to respond to agricultural animal diseases, such as our mobile clinics, we had to work with the departments of health to convert these in order to be used as health centers to reach the most remote and excluded communities. At the continental level, we also had to engage as ministers of agriculture together with ministers of trade and finance to ensure that we prioritize resources to support communities. One of the interesting things that all of us had experienced during this time was going back to using our indigenous knowledge systems. Human instinct saw people using indigenous knowledge to select plants that had medicinal processes to help with respiratory issues. Some in Southern Africa would know plants such as umhlonyane, lingana, and so forth, others called nsukumbili. These were some of the herbs that our great-grandfathers had used in addressing issues of respiratory nature. While dominant science has not recognized these plants, it is our belief that future research should also focus on these biomedical plants to incorporate them into formal science. Program Director, today we celebrate the important milestone in the life of CODESRIA, whose genesis was to build a platform for progressive thought, scholarship, and knowledge development about our world rooted in our perspectives as Africans. It is a moment in which we have to reflect on the journey that we have traversed in achieving our historical mission. This celebration must also enable us to gaze into the future and how we can help develop new knowledge that can assist in managing the problems of today's as well as those that will come. If one looks at the discussion that we've had on the COVID-19 pandemic and its effect, it is evident that its impact will still be felt in many more years to come. The economic disruptions that regress development in many of our countries cannot be underestimated. At the same time, protectionist economic policies, which we have seen emerging post the pandemic, will make it even more harder for some of our countries to rebuild quicker. The increasing inequality and vulnerabilities brought by digitalization will need, in my view, some further examination looking at the experience of COVID-19. Allow me to summarize the few lessons, in my view, that left a mark in some of our minds from this pandemic. Firstly, we witnessed a rise in protectionism which weakened the multilateral systems. Multilateral systems like open trade for the supply of health equipment and vaccines were disrupted as developed countries hoarded the vaccines and health protection materials, leaving little for the developing and underdeveloped countries. In the food sector, we are also observing countries instituting trade policies that protect their domestic interests and disrupt the global food supply. For example, some countries have put in place export bans for agricultural commodities like wheat and rice. Secondly, we learned the value of resource mobilization, which needs to be innovative going into the future. Most African countries face serious difficulties with resource mobilization from outside as a consequence of COVID-19, particularly as international collaboration and support started eroding. Countries that depended on donor aid were forced to find creative ways to mobilize resources internally as well as from the diaspora. There are many examples of how communities working with each other prevented some of the atrocities that would have emerged as a result of this pandemic. Thirdly, the need for improved access to social protection was seen as very critical and essential. Many African countries will continue to struggle to meet the demands of the poor and vulnerable and the unemployed in the absence of well-structured social protection programs. But also it was clear, was compounded by the lack of data that a number of our countries do not have in understanding their societies. However, it is important to acknowledge that some interventions were actually useful during this time in addressing some of the social vulnerabilities. Lastly, effective communication remained as important as prevention and treatment. The circulation of credible and accurate information was key in ensuring that people adhered to health protocols and ascribed to hygiene practices. The use of all communications platforms to spread messages to all citizens did not only conform to the ones that are known, which is your public media and so forth. However, we're to again look at our indigenous systems of communicating with our citizens. In South Africa, for instance, one of the communications methods we had to look at was bringing it to the lowest level into a mahotla, or the local meetings where the chiefs in the villages will convene meetings with communities such that communication will actually flow easily on what needed to be done, but also give feedback on what was working and not working. And some of these communication strategies that have been built then, in my view, would need to continue as the bedrock of ensuring communication between the state and its citizens. Beyond looking at the experiences and lessons learned during COVID, I'd like to close, Chairperson, by looking at what should be, in my view, a relationship maybe between CODESRIA and policymakers. I must close by raising a concern that in my view, a number of our countries are not sometimes formulating policy responses to present-day challenges, learning from evidence that some of you as scholars provide us. In my view, if we have to go to the future and develop better, there's a need for a closer interface. We must seek ways to ensure that the research questions pursued respond to the problems of our society, that the policy ideas suggested by scientists in this community find expression in national policy. It is through such linkages that we will see evidence-based policy making in large part of our continent, and subsequently real development will ensue. I wish to congratulate you once again for reaching this important milestone when you turn 50 years, and hope that 50 years to come, we will grow from what our founding fathers and mothers had done. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister Didiza. I did say that it was not just going to be a solidarity message in the very classic sense of it, but actually a substantive tour de force, which you have shared with us, covering your experiences in participating in CODESRIA related activities, sharing experiences on the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, which ground most of our countries to a halt, and insights on the work which was done in South Africa to mitigate some of the consequences of the pandemic, particularly with regard to food security, and going onward to draw general lessons from the pandemic for all of us. And finally, touching on the very important question of the research policy interface, which I think has been a perennial issue of concern to us, both within CODESRIA, but also in some of the more progressive African policy and political communities. There's quite a lot for us to chew on from this presentation. Sadly, it is a solidarity message, so I'm not going to be opening up for questions to our special guest of honor. If you want to pursue any of these issues further with her, she's still with us, and you can reach her during one of the breaks. But in the meantime, I'd like to pass on to the Executive Secretary to continue with the proceedings of the morning. Thank you again, Honourable Minister. Shall we applaud her once again, please?
Thank you very much, Professor Bayo Lukoshi. I want to also add my word of thank you to the Honourable Thoko Didiza for the very comprehensive message that she's shared with us, and for the privilege and honor of her hosting you in Dakar again. This is your third General Assembly of CODESRIA. I have been counting. So thank you very, very much. We're going to proceed with the program for the day in the manner indicated on the document we shared with you. And we're going to proceed actually from the point where the solidarity message stopped with two presentations by persons whom I consider to have played a very significant role in the founding, but also in the institutionalization of CODESRIA as a research council. In essence, really, CODESRIA militants. We're going to start with Professor Anyang, who I feel it's not fair to be asked to introduce him, because if you don't know him, who do you know? But protocol demands, so Professor Anyang Nyong'o has actually shared his reflections on the founding and institutionalization of CODESRIA in a special issue of CODESRIA Bulletin, which we'll be sharing with you later today. He is a professor of political science who also practices politics, and does so in a manner that is properly informed by the lessons of good political science. He's been a member of CODESRIA from the 1970s when he did his graduate work, studying, initially wanting to do a comparison of Kenya and Cote d'Ivoire, but actually ending up doing quite a bit of work on Cote d'Ivoire as a country. Was there when CODESRIA was at IDEP under the leadership of the late Professor Samir Amin, and subsequently taught in a number of universities in Africa and beyond, and eventually decided to join politics in Kenya, having been among a group of what was called young Turks, fighting against the authoritarian regime of Daniel Arap Moi. He served as Minister of Planning and has served in various other ministries, ended up eventually as a senator in the Kenyan Senate, and is currently the governor of Kisumu County, the county that has a tradition of only electing people with PhD and above. Professor Anyang Nyong'o, welcome.
Thank you very much, my dear friend, Dr. Murunga. Thank you, my colleagues and fellow scholars. I'm a scholar in exile in politics, not out of my choice, but out of compulsion by circumstances in our country, but I don't regret it. Thank you very much, Bayo, for pioneering this panel this morning with a very good speech from my sister over there. When my friend Murunga asked me to have some reflections on CODESRIA after 50 years, I was telling Mahmoud Mamdani I was shocked that 50 years have actually passed and we are still on this earth. And then somebody said just now that we celebrate the next 50 years. That one is rather ambitious. I don't think we shall be there. So let's celebrate this one as it is very meaningful for us. Let me begin by saying the following. As Dr. Murunga said, look, the founding of CODESRIA to me is a very personal experience because I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago in the 70s. And I had a very good PhD committee of very eminent scholars, political economists, Marxists, and so on. And I think they gave me a very good foundation for the kind of study that I wanted to do for my PhD, to compare the development of post-colonial states which were based in plantation agriculture, Cote d'Ivoire and Kenya, one a Francophone country, the other one Anglophone, but both based on white settler capital, using forced labor more or less for agricultural production and controlling the politics of the country in a very patrimonial way. So I was interested in this one, but then I didn't know much about West Africa really, to tell you the truth. And I had read about IDEP and Samir Amin and the work they were doing. So I decided to come to Dakar and spend 3 months at IDEP before I proceeded to Cote d'Ivoire, because I wanted to do Cote d'Ivoire first before I go to Kenya. And so I came to Dakar, and I was thrust in an extremely dynamic, vigorous intellectual institution with very good scholars, very engaging, and very forward-looking. And I enjoyed it, and ended up staying at CODESRIA for about 6 months, at IDEP, before going to Côte d'Ivoire. At that point in time, there were two people who were at IDEP. One was Professor Abdallah Bojra, the other one was Dr. Thandika Makandawire. Their offices were more or less on the ribs of IDEP. You know, they were kind of exiled in innocuous offices in IDEP building. But they were the center of attraction of most people because they were constantly discussing with young people who are there, what is the future of social sciences in Africa? IDEP was a UN institution, very heavily engaged in training of young civil servants and economic planning and development. But Samir himself and his team were also engaged in a lot of political economy discussions on Africa. So IDEP and CODESRIA were more or less symbiotic institutions. They were very much together. IDEP concerned about bringing up CODESRIA, independent of IDEP as a UN institution, to guide and develop social science research and scholarship in Africa. So I got involved in that, and it was very exciting because you know Thandika Mkandawire, when he begins to discuss, he can hold you until 2 in the morning without a break. So Thandika was very engaging. He was needing me, what are you going to do and what not, how is that relevant to the struggle and all that. And in the end, I was so excited about this institution called CODESRIA that they were founding, that subsequently, in that what followed, I was more or less all the time at conferences and seminars and in depth. Now, to go forward a little, because a lot of this you shall read in the bulletin, what was so important about this CODESRIA? CODESRIA, the important thing is that it was founded entirely by African scholars. And although it was supported by donor funds, both Bojra and Thandika made sure that stating the problem, the mission and vision of CODESRIA was purely the subject matter of African scholarship. I remember donors would come and say, what are you doing? We want to approve what you are doing. But they insisted that what we are doing is, yes, we need your funds, but it is to solve our problems in a particular way. In a social science that is not enslaved by received theories that are not relevant to Africa, but that generate those theories and concepts that will help analyze and solve Africa's problem. It was very clear. So Thandika himself was very interested in agriculture and agricultural development in Africa in a political, economic way. And so he helped me, myself, to shape my ideas about what I was going to do in Côte d'Ivoire. I never went to Kenya after that because I was so excited about Côte d'Ivoire, but when I went to Kenya, things were rather dull because of society I knew. I wanted to concentrate on something that I didn't know, that I thought I was learning more about. Kenya, I could always do something about later. To move forward, CODESRIA begins these working groups, which I think still exist. CODESRIA begins this working group of scholars working on various issues. I was charged to lead one of those working groups, which was to look at alliance of classes in rural Africa in fighting the post-colonial state or the neo-colonial state. What is the basis of political organization in this kind of context? How do we understand the class struggles in rural Africa? And so several scholars from various countries came up, from the DRC, from Uganda, from Kenya, Liberia, Swaziland, Ghana, and so on. And I think Mahmoud Mamdani was one of us. And in the end, we edited a book in 1987, which was called Popular Struggles for Democracy in Africa. It helps us understand democracy, not an abstract concept, but a concept based on people trying to liberate themselves from oppression from the control of capital, from the control of elites who have very little sympathy or very little empathy, not so much sympathy, with those majority that they rule. That is to put it generally. But we also understood that there are contradictions at that level. When we talk about class struggle, what do we mean? When we talk about alliances of classes, who allies with who? Is it the same in all societies? And what are the differences? Those nuances became so interesting in our discussions that several articles in Africa Development and the Bulletin, and even Review of African Political Economy, came from those discussions. Now, what's the importance of this? The importance of this is what Godwin Murunga and his team is trying to do now, to continue having research groups, working groups among various African scholars, trying to read their MAs and PhDs, not to make those MAs and PhDs personal thing just for getting certificates and degrees, but make the MAs and PhDs an industry producing knowledge that can help, one, the growth of scholarship, social science scholarship in Africa, but two, the understanding of African societies from a very well-informed social scientific point of view. In other words, understanding our society from a social science point of view should be better than knowing it generally from popular discourse. Because all of us talk every day, especially politicians. We go to rallies and we mobilize them, they take actions. But usually it may not be based essentially on what the problem is. It may be based on what you want the people to know and believe and vote for you. And they do that. They do that. And if you continue doing that without realizing the shallowness of it, you cannot change society. So some of us who are in politics are quite often contradicted. You know, you are there on the platform shouting all these slogans, but you know they mean very little, but you have to shout, because you need votes. But back when you go back and you want to make policies, when you make policies that is going to change society or have effect on development, then you must think differently. You must take off your platform hat and now wear your social science hat and begin looking at the problems of people in a manner that may not be popular, but may lead to good policies. Now, this finds a connection, Godwin, between all these groups that we are having, working groups, doing research and so on, and eventually the kind of politics we have. Because these are the groups that can inform politicians what the reality on the ground is. Reality on the ground. You know, every politician knows what a reality on the ground is. But I think that somebody has done research and has data and information may inform a policymaker what the reality on the ground is much better because of having the tools of social science research. So I do believe, as a politician now, that what CODESRIA has been doing and continues to do is useful to Africa. And I'm glad we have lived for 50 years successfully doing this. And I can see faces that I will never know because I don't have time to know you today, but at least I met you. And I know that you are somewhere working for Africa, promoting social science research, which will eventually help policy making in the public domain. CODESRIA has gone much further than that in institutional development by creating training, grants, and fellowship programs to support the development of dissertation proposals, research skills, publications, and continuous intellectual discourse. Doing this at a time when the space for the social sciences is becoming narrower in African university, CODESRIA has created an invaluable opportunity to sustain critical research and publications, as well as quality of teaching where some limited opportunity may still be available. Mind you, there's a phenomenon going on in Africa. Universities are being established everywhere, at least in Kenya. Polytechnics are becoming universities. So while we need polytechnics to train people with technical skill, the inflation of establishing universities is perhaps counterproductive at times. And then in those universities, by the way, social science is no longer taken seriously. What is much more serious is contract research. where a donor comes with money, we want to know the prevalence of COVID-19 in Homa Bay County and how many shepherds it affected. Shepherds. It can be any part of the population, but every donor comes with a problem that they want solved. And then scholars at the university, social scientists themselves begin writing proposals so that you get that money. You may not know anything about shepherds, but you look at the internet and whatnot, you put shepherd there. And because you have defined shepherd so well, you'll get the money, and you'll go and do something. Whatever the donor does with that money, it's none of your concern, you got the money. So this kind of consultancy industry in our arts and social science faculties have taken over from social science research, quite honestly. And it's very detrimental to scholarship. And that is why creating space outside universities by CODESRIA to organize is very important, because then at least you capture people who are not captured by that contract research in the universities, which is aimed at donor-funded, targeted research or consultancy that keep on circulating all the time in our universities. Social science departments in our universities have become much more consultative-oriented than before. Contract research focused on what is usually justified as policy relevance. You know, policy relevance. I don't know, Godwin, whether in organizing this 50th anniversary and choosing the topic, you are forced to have a topic which has policy relevance. Policy is defined by somebody else. Now, that policy relevance, quite honestly, I remember when I was Department of Political Science at University, we really resisted nowadays and said, no, no, we want policy relevance, the policy should be defined by us and not you. So this kind of research takes a good chunk of time of our scholars. It may very well be that such research actually helps policymakers in government to make policies. Yes, I don't dispute the fact that some of the research don't help policies. When I was Minister for Planning and National Development, we just taken over from a government which was completely bankrupt, and we had to decide with my fellow colleague in finance how we are going to have a policy on taxation. Because people didn't have money, the treasury was bankrupt, so are you going to have tax people who don't have money in their pockets? So what are you going to do? So after a lot of discussion in the cabinet, we came up with a rather simplistic solution, but which worked. Let's broaden the tax base, bring in as many people as possible, even if they are paying 1 shilling each, but broaden it, but reduce the tax rate, so that people have incentives, companies have incentives to pay tax. By the way, we collected more money than we thought we could, and we didn't have to go to IMF and World Bank for budget support. And indeed, the economy grew phenomenally because people had faith in government. Government was not penalizing through taxation. I'm not an economist, but at least it worked. But that was a result of consulting some very good economists who we worked with, and after a lot of discussion came up with something looked simple, but people had to be convinced that it could work. It may very well that such research actually helps policymakers, yes, as it did us, well and good. But the gold rush, this is what I want to emphasize, the gold rush mentality that contract research creates within certain faculties in our universities may be harmful to the time devoted by scholars to such social value issues, such as social inequality, political oppression, gender discrimination, cultural integrity, the integrity of creation, and climate change at the moment. I think that issues that have of value to the survival of humanity today may not necessarily attract contract research, but that is where CODESRIA comes in to state the problem and create space for our social scientists. Finally, I want to mention one of CODESRIA's major achievements. One of CODESRIA's major achievements of these 50 years is that it has created an escape route for scholars who are interested in developing research skills and research methodologies without being tied down to the consultancy culture. It has also created an escape route for our scholars, or a home for our scholars, who are stuck abroad in universities, this is one of the ways by which they can come and connect back with African scholars on the continent and share very good experiences in those universities and maybe become visiting scholars every now and again in our home university, bringing quality research and intellectual discourse in these universities. The Institutes on Democratic Governance, for example, that CODESRIA has created, plays a key role in this year after year. So do that other training programs that bring together graduate students to work on dissertation proposals. People who were in the same position I was in 1973, 74, coming out of University of Chicago, now have programs organized by CODESRIA to discuss their dissertation proposals with people perhaps who, professors and lecturers, with tremendous experience in this area across the board. Conferences provide opportunities for scholars to exchange ideas, discuss theories, and analyze ongoing political and socioeconomic changes in Africa. For example, the series of military coups in West Africa at the moment, all of a sudden provide another opportunity to study military coups. So many years after independence, I think we had forgotten that military coups were part and parcel of African politics, but the series of those coups invite social scientists to ask why? Why now? Why this? Why particularly this area of Africa? Are they likely to spread to other parts of Africa? What explains it? And I think that that can only happen, or one of the ways that it can happen is through CODESRIA, maybe organizing a working group or a conference or a workshop on revisiting military coups in Africa, a subject which was very prevalent and popular in the 60s and 70s. Another one is elections. You know, you can realize that some of these military coups were caused by failed elections in these countries. And elections, as you know, in CODESRIA, we've always discussed elections and whether they are democratic or not. Now, one of the things that's emerging in Africa is that elections are being held not because anybody wants to build democracy. The people who hold elections want election for legitimization. So, provided you hold them and then rough up your opponents and announce results, then you say we have held democratic elections. And then you use force after that to force that democracy on people. In general speaking, but I think that we need now to, as scholars, to study these elections because by themselves they do not constitute a democratic process, nor can they necessarily lead to voters electing their rulers freely and fairly, where rules of the game predetermined who will be elected. First of all, the rules of the game are quite often ignored. In my country, it's a common practice. And people begin scheming how to win the elections, notwithstanding the rules of the game. So defining elections as electing people through predetermined rules of the game that are themselves democratic is a problem in Africa. And I think that it's us scholars who should be able to study this and explain what is possible, therefore. What is the alternative? How can democracy be built in Africa other than by just focusing on elections? Elections are important yet, but by themselves we have seen they have not taken that very far. So we need to revisit the problem as one of the working. Finally, in conclusion, my reflections are an appreciation of CODESRIA's work since its inception 50 years ago, and serve to point out further challenges to this very important social science and humanities research and discussion forum, which is bound to be the home of Africa's social scientists now and into the future. And I'm glad, Godwin, you are looking at the next 50 years. God help you. But I think those next 50 years will obviously build on the experience of these 50 years, which we are glad to have been participated on. But we are now handing over that experience to a younger generation I see here, who will stand here 50 years from today and say we were there when CODESRIA is celebrating its first 50 years. My own reflections also record my own personal appreciation of what I have contributed to and gained from CODESRIA. And I think that it's a very personal reflection but I think a reflection that most of you could easily share and could easily stand here and testify about, because we seem to have very similar histories, perhaps, than we realize. And when we come together here, that is when we know we do. Like the famous Nigerian writer, I don't know whether Welo Soyinka or Chinua Achebe, I can confuse the two quite often, but he said that people don't come, elders don't come into a homestead to drink together and watch the moon because they cannot watch the moon in their own homes. They just come together because they go to come together. And when they come together to eat, it's not because they don't have food in their own homes, but it's good to come together and eat together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Anyang Nyong'o. If I say anything more about what he has said, I will dilute everything. So I won't say more, but you confirmed that the choices of the county of Kisumu in Kenya to go only for leaders with PhD and above makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Prof, again. I want to welcome Professor Penda Mbow to continue this reflection. Professor Penda Mbow is a professor of history, having taught at University Sheikh Anta Diop for a very long time. She's also a CODESRIA militant, but her work goes beyond the academy. She served as a Minister of Culture here in Senegal for a while in 2001, and eventually is currently the president of Mouvement Citoyen, Citizens Movement, where she continues not just the process of teaching society, but also engaging in activism that is designed to change society. I must say that among the most important contributions of Professor Penda Mbow to CODESRIA is that when you call, she comes to assist CODESRIA in whichever way you want. And those of us who live in Dhaka have had the privilege of having to call Professor Penda Mbow to come and join us on a whole range of things, not just within the Gender Institute, but many other institutes that we have held. And together with many others, including Marema Ture, Rokaya Fall, Fatuso, we have been privileged here in Dakar to be guided, to be taught, and to be assisted to advance not just the gender agenda, but also the agenda of CODESRIA. Thank you very much, Professor Penda, for joining us, and welcome.
Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everybody. C'est avec Godwin beaucoup de plaisir, mais aussi une grande émotion que je participe à cette Assemblée générale, marquant les 50 ans ou le cinquantenaire du CODESRIA. Vous savez, si le CODESRIA a 50 ans, nous avons cheminé au sein où nous sommes dans le CODESRIA depuis plus d'une trentaine d'années. Nous avons vu beaucoup de figures passer et malheureusement disparaître. Évidemment, on pense à Samirami, à Sam Moyo, Archima Fedje, Shahida Albaz, à Aminata Diaw, mais aussi à mon grand ami et complice, Helmi Sharawi, et tant d'autres syndicats, et tant d'autres, malheureusement. Comment sommes-nous arrivés au CODESRIA? Nous sommes venus de France, fraîchement arrivés, et ce sont nos collègues Abdoulaye Bathily, Momar Koumba Diop, personnellement, qui m'ont demandé d'aller vers le CODESRIA. Et Aminata Diaw vers le CODESRIA. Et moi, on m'a dirigé, ou plus ou moins, vers les questions de genre, et Aminata vers la gouvernance. Et c'est comme ça que nous sommes entrés au CODESRIA. On a assisté à beaucoup d'événements, des événements inoubliables. Mais des textes aussi nous ont marqués, comme la déclaration de Kampala sur les libertés académiques. Mahmoud Mamdani, je crois qu'il est dans la salle. C'est un texte majeur dans le CODESRIA et tant d'autres. Mais je vois encore ces femmes faire irruption dans une assemblée générale du CODESRIA au Novotel pour exiger que les questions de genre soient prises en compte et constituent le cœur même de cette institution. Je vois encore Amina Mama, Aïcha Imam, Fatou Sow et tant d'autres femmes dire justement il faut que les femmes constituent l'élément moteur du CODESRIA. Ce qui a donné naissance à cet ouvrage incontournable qu'on appelle Engendering Social Sciences. Parce que, ne l'oublions pas, la mémoire en général gomme systématiquement les femmes. Même si elles ont contribué aux luttes, au changement, on les oublie après. Je reviendrai sur les études des décennies de réflexion féministe où en sont les transformations sociales. Pourquoi pour moi le CODESRIA est si important? J'ai fait des études en histoire médiévale, avec Rokhaya qui a fui pour me laisser toute seule avec l'histoire médiévale. Et il fallait enseigner aux étudiants l'histoire médiévale, une période charnière incontournable dans la réflexion historique. Et j'étais orientée vers l'histoire médiévale du monde musulman, l'islam des origines, mais aussi de l'Occident médiéval. Et j'étais principalement intéressée par l'histoire intellectuelle, surtout l'histoire des religions. Mais j'avais un énorme besoin de transformation de notre société. Et en y réfléchissant, je m'étais dit qu'il était impossible peut-être de faire la révolution comme en 1789, et que là où il y a une accélération de l'Europe, c'est-à-dire accélération de l'histoire, c'est-à-dire en Europe, entre le Moyen-Âge, la féodalité et les deux guerres mondiales, on a eu une transformation des sociétés occidentales et principalement un système d'individuation. Et comment faire en Afrique? Nous ne pouvons pas faire la révolution comme en Europe parce que les conditions ne sont pas les mêmes. Qu'est-ce qu'il faut absolument? Et je me disais, peut-être que chacun avait à travailler à sa petite localité, à son échelle. Et c'est comme ça que pour moi, la société civile était devenue un concept, plus qu'un concept, incontournable dans ce que je faisais. Et entre 1977, où j'ai été étudiante, jusqu'à ma première année en tant que jeune assistante en 1986, je n'ai pas cessé d'agir comme si j'étais dans la société civile. C'est après que j'ai compris et que j'ai contribué à installer le concept dans l'espace public sénégalais avant de créer, à partir de 2002, ce qu'on peut appeler le premier mouvement citoyen au Sénégal et peut-être aussi en Afrique. Et c'est là où le CODESRIA était extrêmement important parce qu'il m'a aidé à me relier, à relier mes études historiques avec le besoin de transformation sociale et la réalité, en m'appuyant aussi sur une réflexion approfondie et avec des concepts, pas nouveaux tout à fait, mais que je pouvais mettre en œuvre pour la première fois. Par exemple, pendant cette période du CODESRIA, on a vu des débats. Cette conception, ou en tout cas cette réalité de la terre, la question de la terre, l'ande issue comme aimait dire, feu Samoyo ou Archie était devenu une réalité parce que ce qui se passait en Afrique australe était différent de ce qu'on vivait ici en Afrique de l'Ouest. Et pour moi, la plus grande réussite de panafricanisme, pour le moment, reste encore le CODESRIA. On a vu énormément de personnalités passer. Et nous-mêmes, nous avons eu la chance de parcourir le continent à travers différentes institutions universitaires et des instituts. Et comme ça, on a vu la diversité de la réalité africaine. Et le CODESRIA y a beaucoup contribué. Et c'est ça, le premier élément de ma réflexion. Alors, quelque chose que je vais dire et qui m'a beaucoup rapproché de Helmi Sharawi et de ma sœur Fatima Harrak qui est là, c'est que quand Ablaye Bathily devait partir à une conférence au Caire en 1992, novembre 1992, j'étais Fulbright aux États-Unis, il m'a demandé d'y aller à l'Université du Caire sur les relations afro-arabes. Jeune, avec tout ce que j'ai lu dans l'histoire, j'ai eu une critique très acerbe de ces relations afro-arabes. Et j'ai interpellé nos frères et sœurs à l'Université du Caire, justement, sur leurs relations avec les Noirs et ce que représentait le Noir dans l'histoire depuis les Abbassides, etc. Et ça avait, disons, créé un choc chez Helmi Sharawi. Et depuis ce jour, il ne m'avait pas lâché d'une semelle, il était devenu plus qu'un frère. Et c'est ce qui nous a rapprochés. Et c'est ce que j'ai vu aussi à l'Institut de Rabat, dirigé par Fatima, à l'époque avant elle, Ahmed Tawfiq. Et ça a créé un lien très très fort. Et je rends hommage vraiment à Helmi avec son Arab Center, qui était vraiment quelque chose d'essentiel pour nous. Alors, au CODESRIA, nous avons connu des décennies de réflexions féministes. Et ces réflexions féministes, certainement, nous ont aidés à aborder les transformations sociales. Par exemple, au cours de l'Institut du genre, nous avons traité de la citoyenneté d'avril 2023, de la citoyenneté des femmes, des luttes émancipatrices à la prise du pouvoir et la réflexion personnelle, nous l'avons menée en insistant sur les décennies de féminisme et de transformation. L'impact de ces décennies, avec une accumulation de savoir entre l'Association des femmes africaines pour la recherche et le développement, AFARD, qui était logée au CODESRIA, c'est vrai, il y avait une certaine, disons, couverture des hommes pour nous, les femmes, les jeunes femmes chercheurs, et les différents instituts sur le genre auxquels nous avons participé comme directrice, animatrice ou membre du comité de sélection, ou encore les fameux symposiums du Caire. Ça aussi, c'était des moments extrêmement importants. Et la réflexion globale nous a permis de tracer une trajectoire de lutte pour atteindre une citoyenneté égalitaire et un leadership transformationnel. Je dis que je n'ai pas encore véritablement ce leadership transformationnel, mais le jour où je l'ai, je ferai une petite révolution. En plus, pour moi, l'histoire laisse une discipline de clarification des faits. Le continent africain, depuis le néolithique, c'est-à-dire 4000 ans avant Jésus-Christ, se trouve aux antipodes des civilisations, de la civilisation indo-européenne basée sur le patriarcat. Les différents fonds d'acculturation et leur impact par rapport au statut de la femme s'inscrivent sur une très longue durée. L'islamisation et la colonisation ont modifié le statut de la femme dans les sociétés africaines. Et c'est pourquoi la redécouverte de l'histoire dans ces différentes périodes permet de construire un discours émancipateur. Chaque moment de l'histoire marque un discours sur la femme, mais aussi des attitudes et des actes. Il en fut ainsi de l'Antiquité au XVIIIe siècle, en contact avec l'Occident, à la traite négrière, à la pénétration coloniale, où on note l'implication des femmes dans les luttes de résistance, surtout chez les femmes appartenant aux classes supérieures. De façon générale, les Africaines vont prendre une part décisive dans les luttes pour l'indépendance et la décolonisation, mais aussi les luttes démocratiques. Je peux dire que les dernières années, tout le renouveau du discours démocratique est passé par les femmes. Nous avons peut-être, il y a eu un débat aussi au sein du CODESRIA que nous évoquons par notre propre démarche intellectuelle et pour passer rapidement à quelques actions citoyennes et dire ce que nous attendons pour les prochaines années concernant le CODESRIA. Moi, je suis très optimiste. Je pense que nous allons vivre 120. Maintenant, c'est possible. On sera là encore. Notre contact avec le CODESRIA, je l'ai déjà évoqué. Et on a découvert au sein de l'institution ce qu'on pourrait appeler l'afroféminisme, qui nous a donné la possibilité de nous interroger sur les concepts qui lui sont associés. Moi, j'aime beaucoup, je sais que Fatou Sow a beaucoup critiqué, mais j'aime beaucoup la réflexion de Ayoronke. Par son originalité, cette réflexion qui se centre sur les expériences de femmes africaines et une épistémologie africaine, en remplaçant l'universel abstrait par le principe de l'Ubuntu. Et on réfute le fait selon lequel les personnes humaines, on les connaît à travers l'humanité des autres. J'aurais pu continuer sur cette vision de Oyoronke. Mais la question de la binarité, la colonisation a institué et légitimé la domination masculine. Quant à la décolonisation, elle a laissé en place les structures du pouvoir. C'est pourquoi notre lutte est une lutte encore très difficile. Et la colonialité du genre s'est maintenue et a même été intériorisée par beaucoup d'intellectuels ainsi que des politiques africains. Les historiens, anthropologues, juristes afroféministes mettent en lumière aussi la flexibilité en matière de sexualité dans l'Afrique précoloniale. Je signale aussi qu'un des apports essentiels du CODESRIA, c'est d'avoir essayé de créer cette communauté, justement, des chercheurs, en y incluant en grande partie, justement, les intellectuels de la diaspora, que ce soit la diaspora ancienne ou la nouvelle diaspora. Alors, les historiens, tous ces chercheurs proposent de centrer leur réflexion sur ce passé, et ce passé qui nous a été d'un grand secours, et un des éléments, l'un des textes incontournables à la compréhension des réalités est publié par l'anthropologue nigériane Ifi Amadjoume, auteur de Mal d'autres, Female Husband, paru en 1987. Et dans son travail sur plusieurs sociétés traditionnelles africaines, elle souligne deux points essentiels. Une organisation sociale reposant sur les deux sexes et une langue ne distinguant pas le féminin du masculin, ce qui est très important, et ce qui a permis la normalisation des rôles. Quant à Fatou Sow, elle pense que la base matriarcale a laissé des indices. On est frappé de la centralité des femmes dans l'organisation sociale. Leur contribution à la reproduction des familles, à leur entretien domestique, à l'éducation et à la transmission des valeurs culturelles avec leur comportement au quotidien. Je crois que Fatou Sow a mené une réflexion approfondie au-delà de Gender Social Sciences, parce que c'est l'une des plus grandes chercheurs, en tout cas en langue francophone en Afrique, sur la question. Et la nécessité pour nous de réécrire l'histoire de la mémoire collective, comment systématiquement les femmes, devient un impératif. La femme est présente, infiniment présente sur l'ensemble des scènes, pour citer encore Fatou Sow, domestique, économique, intellectuelle et même ludique de la société. Au-delà de ce que j'ai retenu des femmes, nous-mêmes, nous avons mené toute une réflexion sur la citoyenneté de la femme entre sphère privée et religion, et la religion est mon dada. Mais je crois que le CODESRIA a renforcé une dynamique chez moi, c'est que la réflexion aussi découle du legs de nos aînés. La trajectoire intellectuelle du Sénégal, certaines rencontres décisives et notre implication dans différents rôles ont fait éclore en nous et de façon précoce une série de questionnements qui ne trouvent pas forcément de réponse. La génération présence africaine, la maison d'édition fondée en 1947, est largement revenue sur l'identité des Noirs, Senghor, la négritude, l'antériorité de l'Afrique noire et la place de la femme Cheikh Anta, qui nous donne des arguments véritables. La question de la femme dans la pensée marxiste-léniniste. Chez les communistes africains, par exemple, le parti de l'indépendance dirigé par Majmoud Diop et le système matrilinéaire de transmission des pouvoirs par les linguistes Pate Diagne. J'avais souvent des discussions avec Majmoud Diop qui disait que la contradiction avec les femmes, la question des femmes était secondaire par rapport à la contradiction principale. Donc les marxistes, mais Pate Diagne, j'aime beaucoup sa métaphore quand il dit dans le pouvoir traditionnel que c'est un bâton maternel qui a tracé le site. Ce contexte de débat intellectuel exceptionnel a forgé notre prise de conscience. Nous allons essayer de juger problématique à partir de deux éléments, les pouvoirs féminins dans un contexte de suggestion et d'infériorité et la réflexion féministe en islam. Je vais passer très rapidement. Pour retenir des pouvoirs des femmes, s'agit-il, on s'est posé des questions, d'une autorité pleine et entière, détenue par les femmes dans une sphère spécifique, une autorité d'ailleurs souvent exercée aux dépens des autres femmes, d'autres femmes, comme une participation limitée et minoritaire du pouvoir des hommes, ou bien comme des contre-pouvoirs séducteurs, secrets, illicites, ou encore comme une réappropriation et un détournement, qui est retournement contre le dominateur, des instruments symboliques qui instituent la domination masculine. La construction d'une périodisation propre à l'évolution du statut des femmes devait être envisagée pour mieux étudier les modalités de pouvoir. Je passe sur beaucoup de choses, mais je vais m'arrêter sur un aspect qui, pour moi, est un aspect déterminant dans la quête de la citoyenneté. C'est vrai que j'ai beaucoup travaillé et utilisé, moi c'est la recherche-action, par exemple, dans ce cadre, sur la question des castes, est une question majeure aussi chez moi. Mais femmes et islam est resté un élément essentiel dans une société comme la nôtre. Nous avons publié dans un ouvrage collectif dirigé par Ibrahim Sall, ici, intitulé la question des libertés, surtout sur les academic freedom chez les femmes, où j'ai relaté une expérience, parce que dans les années 90, quand j'ai voulu vraiment aller vers le féminisme en islam, ce qui était nouveau pour les Sénégalais, c'est vrai, j'ai eu à faire face à énormément, s'il n'y avait que des critiques, mais de menaces de toutes sortes, j'ai écrit le texte que vous allez trouver dans Academic Freedom. Et ce qui était intéressant par rapport à cette question sur l'islam et les femmes, c'était vraiment une demande. On va assister à un foisonnement de publications, car les enjeux furent énormes après la révolution iranienne en 1979. Et ces publications portaient sur la sexualité en islam, l'exégèse du Coran, je pense à Amina Woudoud, dans une approche pluridisciplinaire. Et la Fatima Mernissi, pour moi, était une découverte en 1987 par le canal de Madame Mbow. Et Fatima Mernissi, cet ouvrage a été le début, en tout cas, d'une réflexion qui m'était propre sur femmes et islam pour apporter quelques réponses à notre société. Il y a aussi d'autres travaux comme chez Abdelwahab Boudiba, Margot Badran, Asma Lamblawet et tant d'autres. Et ces publications constituent un tournant pour la femme musulmane car pendant plus de 14 siècles d'une pensée islamique, on a produit une interprétation des textes de l'islam faite essentiellement par les hommes. Et Amina Woudoud est la première femme reconnue par l'interprétation des textes. Elle a réexaminé, réinterprété les textes et revu les concepts. Les musulmans progressistes ont toujours argué qu'il ne s'agit pas du texte en tant que tel, mais d'une vision patriarcale de l'interprétation et de la mise en œuvre des préceptes religieux. Et pourquoi on s'était attaqué à moi à l'époque? On disait que, par exemple, tel féministe ne connaissait pas l'islam, mais moi, que j'étais très dangereuse parce que je connaissais les textes et il fallait m'arrêter tout de suite. Bon, c'est vrai. Dans mes cours aussi, et ça c'était un élément intéressant, quand je suis arrivée à l'université, on a estimé qu'une femme ne devait pas enseigner l'islam. Et c'est vrai, je me suis beaucoup battue par la connaissance simplement pour pouvoir enseigner l'islam et après, j'ai été respectée. Et c'était le début où il y avait une vision un peu islamiste, je parlais de la révolution, et les garçons qui étaient dans l'association des étudiants musulmans, tout ce petit monde-là, les Ibadur Rahman, mais tout se liait à des arguments, et avec la radio, la télévision de Sidi Laminias, j'étais tout le temps dans les débats pour cela. Mais je m'appuyais sur un travail de déconstruction de la charia. où j'ai démontré que la charia n'était pas un dogme, que la charia était une construction humaine 2 siècles après le prophète. Et tout ça, j'ai travaillé à partir d'hymnes comme quelqu'un comme Mohamed Arkoun, d'autres comme Abdel Wahab, comment il s'appelle, Abou Ansar Filali, et tant d'autres, et je crois Abdel Razak. Et je suivais particulièrement ce qui se passait dans les pays musulmans comme le Soudan avec l'exécution du maître de... je vais y revenir. Donc, je les suivais et une des questions centrales dans ma réflexion était la laïcité. Parce que j'estimais qu'on ne pouvait pas construire l'égalité entre l'homme et la femme si on n'était pas dans un espace laïque. Et il me fallait beaucoup d'arguments pour cela. Donc, j'ai travaillé sur la laïcité, donc des questions à un moment où c'est extrêmement difficile. Et il fallait préserver la Constitution. Et quand en 2000, Abdoulaye Wade a voulu enlever le concept de laïcité de la Constitution, nous les femmes, avec les chrétiens, nous nous sommes battus parce que nous étions les 2 minorités pour que la laïcité reste, demeure, et que seul dans un contexte laïque, nous pouvions avancer. Dans notre démarche, nous n'excluons pas la connaissance de pères penseurs et théologiens conservateurs comme Ibn Taymiyyah, Al-Ghazali et tant d'autres. Ces penseurs en général offrent une base aux idées islamistes, aux tenants de l'islam politique qui remettent en cause la philosophie des droits humains et proposent l'application de la loi islamique. Donc voilà à peu près tout le travail. Et puis il fallait revoir la politique des fatwas, qu'est-ce qu'il fallait y entendre. Et c'est vrai, j'ai été soutenue aussi dans tout ce que je faisais par le mouvement démocratique sénégalais, mais aussi par une grande personnalité religieuse de l'époque, le khalife général des Tidjanes, El Hadji Abdoul Aziz Sy. Tout à l'heure, je pourrais parler de l'exécution de Mohamed Taha, théologien musulman libéral qui fut exécuté par le Ghaffar el-Némeri du Soudan. Donc, nous avons travaillé sur toutes ces questions et ça me donnait en tant que femme des arguments. Et peut-être aussi il y a un côté un peu paternaliste quand on pense que seuls les hommes ont la capacité et la possibilité d'accéder à la connaissance sur la religion. Alors si mes arguments étaient solides, j'ai été souvent critiquée, respectée. Et nous avons eu des prises de position sur les femmes quand on a voulu assassiner, tuer Safia Husseina pour adultère, les enfants de Chibok, etc. Et ça continue, le travail doit continuer, on n'abandonnera pas, etc. Mais qu'avons-nous tiré aussi de tout cela pour construire une citoyenneté égalitaire? Ce qui nous a ouvert la voie de l'action adossée à la recherche. Nos moyens d'action portèrent sur l'interprétation, la dénonciation, l'initiation de pétitions, l'organisation de débats dans les médias et la création, je l'ai dit, du premier mouvement citoyen au Sénégal et peut-être en Afrique. Il est évident que cette partie doit tenir compte de quelques aspects, ce que c'est que la démocratie, ce que c'est que le féminisme dans la démocratie et le mouvement contemporain des femmes qui prolonge et l'actualise. Toute l'histoire devrait être écrite en fonction de l'articulation changeante de leur forme de pouvoir symbolique et réelle, théorique et pratique, politique, économique, culturelle, l'influence, etc. Alors, ce sont ces expériences dans un contexte d'évolution des idées et des mouvements d'émancipation de la femme qui doit déboucher, de mon point de vue, sur la conceptualisation et la place dans les théories politiques. Avec quelles personnes ressources avons-nous aussi réussi à appréhender la situation des femmes en général et des Africaines en particulier? L'engagement militant en faveur des droits, et particulièrement des droits des femmes, n'était pas mis à l'honneur. Depuis plusieurs décennies, nous sommes devenus une activiste sociale et politique sans répit, préoccupés par le combat contre les injustices et les préjugés affectant toutes nos sociétés, notamment les sociétés en voie de construction comme la société sénégalaise. Pleinement consciente de la nécessité, alors nous sommes partie prenante de beaucoup d'actions, initiatives du 5 mars pour la transparence des élections, tant d'autres, mais aussi un aspect essentiel que sont les assises nationales que nous avions lancées avec des politiques en 2008 et que nous voulons justement remettre sur le tapis pour faire face aux problèmes actuels que nous avons sur la démocratie. Je vais conclure en disant une chose au CODESRIA. C'est vrai, et là, ça interpelle toutes les consciences surtout les décideurs africains. On ne peut pas laisser cette organisation sans lui trouver les moyens, non seulement de travailler, de survivre, parce qu'on ne peut pas changer le continent sans l'élaboration d'idées fortes, structurées, qui doivent être à la base de la transformation sociale. Les chefs d'État doivent faire, au lieu de donner leur argent par-ci, par-là, des gens comme moi, Ibrahim, au lieu de soutenir des chefs d'État qui sont déjà repus, feraient mieux de financer des organisations comme le CODESRIA. Si aux États-Unis, les grands think tanks, et que ce soit l'éducation, la recherche, elles sont soutenues par des forces sociales. Si aux États-Unis, on est arrivé à ce niveau de développement, c'est parce qu'aussi il y a des fondations, des think tanks, tout est, même des, comment on appelle ça, des remises d'impôts pour soutenir vraiment ceux qui réfléchissent et ceux qui pensent. On les met dans d'excellentes conditions. Et nous, le CODESRIA, qui doit être le fer de lance de ce panafricanisme que nous voulons demain réaliser, si on ne soutient pas le CODESRIA, si on ne lui donne pas les moyens, on ne peut pas tout le temps s'adosser à SAREC, à SIDA, etc. Mais il faut que les Africains prennent conscience. Même à un niveau individuel, ceux qui ont les moyens, au lieu de mettre ces moyens dans des dispositions, il faut créer des fondations et les centres de recherche. Et le CODESRIA, il faut absolument un fort plaidoyer au niveau de l'Union africaine pour que le CODESRIA quand même soutenu. Je dirais aussi, pour l'avenir, aujourd'hui on a eu la pandémie du Covid. Le CODESRIA est en train d'élaborer une réflexion en uniformisant, en mettant ensemble toute cette réflexion par-ci, par-là, pour faire face à la pandémie, mais aussi d'autres pandémies vont arriver. Il faut d'autres pandémies, d'autres défis seront là. Il faudra absolument trouver les moyens, en tout cas en termes d'idées, pour que demain, qu'on puisse être au rendez-vous, justement, de cette demande qui sera une demande de plus en plus cruciale. L'immigration clandestine, peut-être ça peut être un grand sujet pour le CODESRIA. Aujourd'hui, j'ai appris que dans les morgues d'Espagne, les morgues sont remplies de jeunes Africains qu'on met dans des fosses communes. Ce phénomène est un phénomène qui nous interpelle, tous interpelle notre conscience. Et je crois que l'un des plus grands défis, je le dis depuis longtemps, et Peter en a parlé, c'est que nous devons faire le point maintenant de la démocratie. Partout, la démocratie est en crise. On dit d'ailleurs, on parle de nouvelles initiatives pour reprendre en main la démocratie. Mais en Afrique, nous devons nous arrêter peut-être pour faire le point des alternances démocratiques en Afrique. Qu'est-ce que ces alternances ont apporté? Et c'est une des réponses, de mon point de vue, à ces coups d'État militaires à n'en plus finir sur le continent. C'est parce qu'on a échoué dans la démocratie. Les élections ne sont pas seulement la démocratie. Et il faut faire le point. Dans des pays où on a connu les conférences nationales, ces pays sont profondément en crise et au fond, l'alternative n'est pas seulement d'organiser des élections, mais au-delà des élections, et je crois dans beaucoup de pays, y compris le nôtre, la société est totalement en train d'échapper aux hommes politiques. Et la question du leadership est une autre question qu'il faudra aborder. Vous avez essayé, sous Olokoshi, d'aller vers les leaders, leur parler. Mais pourquoi pour moi la question du leadership, elle est essentielle? On ne peut pas continuer à travailler avec ce leadership, qui est un leadership faible intellectuellement pour apporter des réponses à nos problèmes. Nous devons renouer avec le leadership des années 60, c'est-à-dire leadership combinant une démarche intellectuelle profonde et une vision du continent, et justement un leadership politique qui renonce à tout privilège rien que pour l'Afrique. Merci.
I've just figured out that I'm not the right person to chair this session. Because I'm enjoying a little too much to control the time. We're going to try and extend this session by another 30 minutes. I know it's going to have implications in the evening, but I think we need to hear from you. So we're going to ask for some interventions from the floor. This turned out to be a rigorous reflection on the history of CODESRIA, but also a rigorous reflection on what the future holds for us. So if there are mics somewhere, I would like to take a few questions. I'm sure there are CODESRIA staff somewhere who can help us with the mic. Samuel? I'm sure Samuel is somewhere. Please, you can pick some of the mics here. I would like to take a number of questions. Can we start at the back?
Thank you. Mine is a testimony. You have all reported the different types of interventions that is today called 50th anniversary of CODESRIA. I want to say that CODESRIA produced me, and it is an opportunity to thank CODESRIA. In 1992 and 1994, I won the thesis writing awards of CODESRIA, one of the few African scholars that won that award twice. I want to say here that the two awards led to the Peace and Conflict Studies programs of the University of Ibadan. And everywhere I travel to, when being introduced, I usually include the thesis writing award. And colleagues will say, you are bigger than these two awards. Why are you always referring to these two awards? And my response is that that was where I started from. And it is said that a river that forgets its origin would dry up. I don't want to dry up. Therefore, I'm here to thank CODESRIA for making me and several other scholars. Tandika met me in Oxford, and he looked at me, and he said, I knew you'd be successful. But he said a few African scholars did not believe that picking you up at the level of master's degree was a wise decision, because it was criticized for bringing me to the CODESRIA conference on structural adjustment program. That was my beginning. Today, I'm one of the best cited scholars in security studies in the world, not in Africa.
Thank you very much. The children of CODESRIA are very many if we begin where we started on Monday.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm one of them. My name is Evans Osaboye from Nigeria. I happened to join CODESRIA family in 2007. And three of my colleagues then, we are also here in this hall. And today we are at the level of professorial cadre. Thank you so much. CODESRIA has been the family for me. Two quick questions to our colleagues who are now in the government. Thanks so much, the governor. I enjoyed the narrative. One quick question, I was impressed with how the government of Kenya was able to increase the tax base and then increase the revenue for the government. I happen to be an editor of Nigerian Economic Society, and this is one of the key questions that we are having with the government. The aim is, what the government is doing is to increase the tax rate, but we said it's better to understand that we should increase the tax net. So I would like to know how it was done in Kenya, that the tax base was increased and bring the tax rate and then increase the government revenue. Because basically, we are facing a situation whereby everybody talks about national cake and nobody talks about how the cake can be baked before it will be shared. So we'd like to know how it was done in Kenya so we can take that home for our country. Second question was the issue of the Shepherd research, that we depend more on the consultancy. For us, we say in Nigeria that our take-home pay cannot take us home. So the one way out is to depend on such funding so you can support yourself before you can do research, because it takes a stomach that is being fed that can think very well. So we want to know how what's the way forward? How can governments of Africa support African research so we don't depend on funds from outside Africa to do research as what we call a nomadic researcher? Thanks so much.
Thank you. Right there.
Merci de me donner la parole. Aristide Bitouga, Cameroun. Nous célébrons depuis lundi le cinquantenaire du CODESRIA et les présentations qui ont été faites font le bilan des causes sociales et sociétales qui ont été portées par le CODESRIA toutes ces années, les combats autour de la décolonisation, et la dernière présentation était assez marquante sur les combats menés autour des causes féministes. Moi, j'ai un souci, en tant qu'anthropologue qui s'intéresse aux peuples autochtones, de demeurer dans ce qui me fait moi mal au cœur, cette invisibilité des peuples autochtones dans les causes scientifiques qui sont portées par le CODESRIA. Et donc, je voulais poser la question, à quand un institut sur les peuples autochtones? Les thématiques qui ont été présentées pendant l'Assemblée générale ont adressé toutes des thématiques qui étaient pertinentes, mais on n'a pas eu une thématique adressée sur les peuples autochtones face aux enjeux, notamment les enjeux liés au Covid-19, qui n'ont pas laissé ces peuples-là dans l'état qui était le leur. Ils ont également été impactés, mais ils ont été plus impactés que nous parce qu'ils sont confrontés à un certain nombre d'invisibilités. L'invisibilité du point de vue de nous les chercheurs. Moi, je sors du Cameroun où vous fouillez dans les bibliothèques des universités, très peu de travaux leur sont consacrés. Vous fouillez dans les thématiques des colloques internationaux, même au niveau du continent, très peu adressent les peuples autochtones. Et aujourd'hui, la menace des pandémies et des épidémies est là devant nous. Ils sont également absents du débat. Que faisons-nous de ces peuples autochtones? Merci.
Thank you very much. Any other? Teresa? And I can take opportunity to answer your question directly. Watch out for a call for applications on indigenous knowledge systems sometime around April next year.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all the presenters for very inspiring speeches. My question is directed at the Honourable Thoko Didiza, the Minister of Agriculture in South Africa. You made a very profound statement, at least in my view, when you say that one of your concerns, if I got you right, about CODESRIA and connection with African governments was this rather limited interface between the research that we are doing and influencing policymakers. Would you care just to elaborate in terms of what are your expectations? How do you see this interface developing? In what concrete ways can CODESRIA really begin to inform policy making in Africa? Thank you.
You can hand over the mic to the gentleman. Yes, right there.
Thank you. I'd like to also commend the speakers of this morning. That was very insightful and we are grateful. I have a question for Professor Penda. My question is, you have spoken very passionately about the African woman's emancipation. What do you see as the role for CODESRIA and its membership in shaping the initiatives that are coming up about gender transformative education as a pathway to the emancipation of the African woman?
Thank you. I'm going to take two final questions if there are. One right there. And is there anyone else? And Semala right there.
Thank you. My question is premised on this interface between CODESRIA and African governments. And it's in the area of funding. Isn't it necessary for CODESRIA to insist that every African national government should, in fact, be an institutional member of CODESRIA. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Simala from Kenya. I would like to invite Professor Penda and Professor Anyang to help us understand, because I've been very keen to understand the history of CODESRIA, and it's embedded in the Bandung spirit. And the Bandung spirit was to actually promote the collaboration between economic and cultural development of society. But apparently, since its establishment, CODESRIA has been more on economic development than cultural, meaning it's more in the social sciences than the humanities. Whereas we talk about the humanities, it is like we are tolerating humanities and not accepting them fully as part of the CODESRIA intellectual agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Semala. Can I please request the presenters to take 3 minutes maximum to respond to the questions, and I'll start with the Honourable Thoko Didiza, then Penda, and then Professor Anyang.
Thank you very much, Godwin, and thanks to the colleagues for the questions that I've asked. Even though you had said, as a chief guest speaker, I'm not to ask, or rather respond, question or be asked, but nonetheless, I think some of the issues that raised provoked others to raise questions. Indeed, I raised this matter because I feel the work that, and rather the wealth of the work that CODESRIA has done, its members as well as its institution, would be of value in shaping policy, particularly for African governments. And therefore, for me, raising the question is about how do we find ways in which this relationship has to occur and be strengthened. The number of research, that governments commission, and most of the time you would see that those would either lend to international organizations without really looking internally, and institutions like CODESRIA to be able to undertake those research work that government commission, which in my view shouldn't happen, or rather it's a pity because we've missed in the process what could influence policy for our governments. So the concern raised, it's about helping us find a better way in which we can actually strengthen this collaboration. If you look at the universities, some of which that participate from our different countries, the question is how those universities can also be strengthened in terms of their participation in CODESRIA and building a cohort of young researchers in being able to have rigor in the issues that they deal with that respond to the challenge that our countries and our continent face. How then do our governments also collaborate with those public institutions for the benefit of resolving the country's problems? So it was in that context that I was raising it. I know my brother is going even further to say, shouldn't it be mandatory that African governments must be members of CODESRIA? Yes, that's another route, but how do you do it? And I think that's the question that is for all of us to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Penda.
Je vais essayer de faire très très vite. Le CODESRIA a beaucoup contribué, je ne dis pas à la formation, mais à l'encadrement des femmes intellectuelles. J'ai essayé de l'expliquer en prenant un peu comme exemple mon propre parcours, mais je pense que aujourd'hui, je n'ai pas le temps, mais je vous aurais raconté, par exemple, dans les instituts, il y a un qui est décédé malheureusement aujourd'hui, Nafé Keïta, quand tous ces jeunes gens, il y avait des jeunes gens qui participaient au Gender Institute, à l'Institut sur le genre, un professeur algérien, ils sont venus avec beaucoup de condescendance par rapport aux femmes. Mais quand ils se sont rendus compte des capacités intellectuelles des femmes qu'il y avait dans l'Institut, les ressources disponibles au sein de la bibliothèque du CODESRIA, et quand ils se sont, au bout d'une semaine, ils ont changé complètement de vision et de point de vue sur la question des genres. Avec l'histoire du féminisme, je regrette une chose, les hommes ne lisent pas beaucoup les femmes, malheureusement. Ça, il faut le reconnaître. Et ils ne participent pas beaucoup au débat. Le CODESRIA est l'une des rares institutions, mais je vous assure, quand ils seront confrontés, les hommes confrontés au niveau de réflexion des femmes, ils changent complètement de perspective. Le CODESRIA, les pays membres institutionnels du CODESRIA, moi je pencherai plutôt pour l'Union africaine. Et certains grands leaders, s'ils veulent être des sponsors, offrir quelque chose au CODESRIA, je suis d'accord. Mais le jour où les pays seront membres, ils essaieront de caporaliser l'institution et chercher à l'orienter selon leurs propres intérêts, comme ils ont fait avec beaucoup d'organisations de la sous-région, des organisations, si vous voulez, régionales. Et à partir de ce moment, il sera extrêmement difficile d'avoir cette autonomie de pensée dont on a tant besoin au CODESRIA pour faire avancer les choses. Je termine par cette dernière question. Mais vous savez, nos premiers intellectuels et universitaires, j'ai cité Présence africaine, accordaient une place de choix à la question culturelle. Même la réflexion, les réflexions qui étaient menées sur l'État, l'avenir de l'État, étaient fondées justement sur cette réflexion culturelle. Mais vous savez, quand Huntington a sorti son livre, j'étais dans une réunion, il y avait des Samir, Marie-Angélique, tout ce monde-là. Moi, j'avais dit, en historienne, que Huntington, il faut absolument accorder un grand intérêt à l'ouvrage de Huntington parce que le monde va découvrir les idées qui sont développées. Tout le monde m'a sauté dessus, y compris Samir Amin. Mais je n'ai pas changé. D'un iota, je dis les questions culturelles vont dominer le monde et très bientôt, et Huntington aura raison. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes dans cette vision justement où la culture est au cœur des actions politiques et de l'action politique. Tout est religion, tout est culture, tout le racisme, toutes ces questions aujourd'hui sont des questions culturelles avant d'être des questions politiques. C'est la raison pour laquelle je pense on ne peut pas ne pas renouer avec l'esprit de Bandung. Qu'est-ce qui va sortir de toutes ces guerres que nous connaissons? Est-ce qu'on va aller vers une autre guerre froide? Qu'est-ce qui va se passer? Mais nous devons anticiper, nous, Africains, surtout que notre continent est devenu la cible de tous les intérêts du monde, nous devons nous adosser sur une véritable réflexion culturelle pour pouvoir faire face. Et j'avoue que la question des humanités, Godwin aussi, doit être au cœur de l'agenda du CODESRIA.
Hello, yes, good, it's working. I'll only say two things. One, I think that social science research and issues of culture are very much close related. But CODESRIA must live by its mission. Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. Because if it departs of that, it may spread itself too thin. I think it was founded very specifically to be a council for the development of social science research in Africa, which is a major task, really. But it doesn't mean that when cultural issues are also relevant to discussing social sciences, you alienate them. I think there's not rigid boundary between the two. The other thing I would like to discourage, really, is expect African governments to be members of CODESRIA. You just mess yourself up. I don't think so. I think CODESRIA should continue as does successfully for 50 years. Indeed, their foundations like CIDA, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, and all kinds of, their interest social science, supporting social science research in Africa. And CODESRIA has done very well working with development partners who are committed to social science research, and that is very, very successfully, I think. But approaching African government to be institutional members of CODESRIA would be a disaster, I think, myself. Finally, I really think that what CODESRIA has done, which is really good, and it must continue to do, is having a very close working relation between the social sciences and humanities. I think I've seen some of CODESRIA's working groups in this domain. Because if you look at African literature, the literature that people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o write and all that, they have a lot to deal with social issues, socioeconomic issues. And you can't divorce literature, which discusses human conditions from the attention of social scientists. I think literature is so powerful and so influential and so engaging that social scientists should engage with the literary world, because it is just good to do so. It helps to do so. It's part of the formation of knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, let's applaud the panel for the applaud. Thank you very much. I think that the panel and the chief guest have made an intervention that gives us a base for the subsequent reflections after this. I think that we hope that by the end of the day we'll have moved from that historical trajectory to reflecting about where CODESRIA wants to be in the next 50 years. Bayo assured us that he plans to be there. So it's good that we have. Thank you very much. We'll have a tea break for 20 minutes. Please join us in 20 minutes to begin the next panel.